Well, members of the Parliament of the Netherlands, it's an honor to testify before this committee about the crimes of the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, ISIS. In September 2015, members of the International Association of Genocide Scholars, of which I was once the president, representing the world's largest organization of experts on genocide, called upon the United States Congress and the European Parliament to declare that the crimes committed by the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, also known as Daesh, constitute genocide in violation of the International Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. On November 25th, 2015, 21 human rights organizations, genocide scholars, and religious leaders wrote to President Obama imploring him and the U.S. Department of State to recognize that ISIS is committing genocide, and not just against the Yazidis, but also against Christians, Shia Muslims, Turkmen, Shabaks, and other religious groups that ISIS labels infidels or apostates. The U.S. Congress and European Parliament, as well as the parliaments of the United Kingdom and Canada, passed resolutions stating that ISIS is committing genocide. As you know, genocide is the intentional destruction in whole or in part of a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group as such. ISIS is committing genocide against religious groups that do not conform to ISIS's totalitarian definition of true Islam. ISIS's mass murders of the Chaldean, Assyrian, Melkite, Greek, and Coptic Christians, Yazidis, Shia Muslims, Sunni Kurds, and other religious groups meet even the strictest definition of genocide. ISIS's policy of mass rape is also genocidal. The gendered pattern of persecution pursued by ISIS against groups it considers to be infidels conforms to historical patterns of genocide, particularly the mass killing of men and teenage boys, accompanied by the rape and enslavement of women and teenage girls, and the kidnapping of children. ISIS government in areas it has occupied includes beheadings of captives and people considered apostates, destruction of religious centers such as churches and monasteries, and pillage of ancient cultural sites that do not conform to the regime's religious orthodoxy, acts typical of genocidal regimes. The view that only a court has the authority to declare that genocidal acts constitute genocide is profoundly wrong. It ignores the very name of the Genocide Convention, the Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Courts are always too slow to prevent genocide. They always judge genocide after it is over. State parties to the Genocide Convention have a duty to prevent by other means, including diplomacy, sanctions, and ultimately the use of force, either authorized by the UN Security Council or by regional forces under Chapter 8 of the UN Charter. So the question is, what difference would it make to call these crimes genocide? Wouldn't it be enough to simply call them crimes against humanity? Because after all, genocide is a crime against humanity. Well, we have actually studied this question. Genocide scholars have shown that calling genocide by its proper name rather than by using euphemisms, such as ethnic cleansing, or weaker terms, increases the probability of forceful action to end the crime by over 4 times. So the question is, what difference would it make? And we actually studied this in 2007 when 3 epidemiologists and I conducted a study of the effect of using the words ethnic cleansing rather than genocide in 4 of the most recent genocides: Rwanda, Bosnia, Kosovo, and Darfur. Our team counted the number of uses of the terms ethnic cleansing and genocide in the New York Times, UN press releases, law journals, and statements by Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. We came to four important conclusions. Use of the terms has no relationship to the number of people who have been killed. 8,000 were killed at Srebrenica, and it was ruled genocide by the ICTY. Yet, a UN Commission of Inquiry ruled that over 30,000 killed in Darfur, now it's over 300,000 and probably more than that, was not sufficient evidence of intent to commit genocide by the government of Sudan. Secondly, choice of the term to be used is determined largely by willingness to take action to stop the killing. When the terms ethnic cleansing or crimes against humanity were used, it indicated unwillingness to take forceful action to stop the crimes. These weak words never motivated the use of force. Indeed, they were probably chosen because the decision whether or not to use force had already been made. Now, I know as a lawyer that crimes against humanity and genocide are equally grave offenses against international law. But the truth is that in popular use, and even among lawyers, the word genocide is a more powerful word than crimes against humanity. It was not until the term genocide was applied to the crimes in these cases that force was used to stop them. This occurred 3 months into the genocide in Rwanda when the State Department finally acknowledged on June 10, 1994, that acts of genocide in Rwanda were the same as genocide, which is defined in the Genocide Convention as acts. The declaration came after the U.S. had voted in the UN Security Council to pull UNAMIR troops out of Rwanda on April 21, 1994, and voted against sending in UN forces in May, when the killing was still underway. By June 10th, the Rwandan Patriotic Front had won the civil war and stopped the genocide. 800,000 Rwandans were slaughtered. The U.S. and other world powers were not willing to risk the life of a single soldier to protect them. The International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda has convicted over 50 leaders of that genocide, and courts in Rwanda have convicted hundreds more. The same denial emerged in Bosnia, as the world press and the U.S. government called the massacres ethnic cleansing from 1991 until the Srebrenica massacre on July 11 through 13, 1995, which provoked a NATO conference on July 21, 1995, and resulted in NATO bombing of Serb forces on August 30th. The bombing brought Serbia to Dayton to agree to a ceasefire, division of Bosnia, and a NATO peacekeeping operation. The Bosnian Civil War came to an end. The ICTY and International Court of Justice have ruled that the massacre at Srebrenica was genocide. Kosovo is probably the best example of the power of the term. Kosovo was called ethnic cleansing by U.S. War Crimes Ambassador Kosovo was called ethnic cleansing up until the moment when U.S. War Crimes Ambassador David Sheffer noted, quote, indicators of genocide on April 7, 1999. This was after, quote, only, I take that in quotes, 10,000 people had been killed. But hundreds of thousands were fleeing their homes. This statement on April 7, 1999 was followed immediately by bombing of Belgrade, which brought Serb surrender and NATO occupation of Kosovo. I remember it vividly because I came to The Hague shortly after that and remember when the Dutch Foreign Ministry had the courage to stand in front of the Hague Appeal for Peace and declare the Netherlands' support for that bombing. It was a particularly courageous act because basically most of the 10,000 documents, people who came to that Hague conference were pacifists. He was booed. I thought he should have been cheered because in fact that bombing and that resolute action by the Netherlands and NATO. Stop the genocide. And I just visited Kosovo in March and saw that it has now become a peaceful country again. Regarding Darfur, this is in my view, the exception that proves the rule. Following a careful empirical survey of evidence of genocide among Darfuri refugees, on September 9, 2004, Secretary of State Colin Powell declared that, quote, genocide has occurred and may still be occurring in Darfur. We believe the evidence corroborates the specific intent of the perpetrators to destroy a group in whole or in part. He also said, however, no new action is dictated by this determination. So, on the one hand, we were delighted that he said it was genocide, but we thought it undermined the duties of state parties to the Genocide Convention to, at the same time, say that no new action was dictated. The decision evidently had been made by the president not to involve U.S. or NATO military forces in stopping that genocide. So all that followed were ineffective increases in the African Union monitoring force, but no direct military intervention by NATO or the U.S. The International Criminal Court has charged the Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir and 2 others with genocide in Darfur, yet they have never been arrested and brought to trial. Sudan has 3 active genocides going on today, including the continuation of the Darfur genocide. It's an example of the failure of the UN to stop genocide and of the African Union and states parties to the ICC treaty to enforce international criminal law. Our conclusion, and the study is published, in fact, in the European Journal of Public Health. It was published in 2007, May 18th, and you can find it on the Genocide Watch website, which is genocidewatch.com, genocidewatch.net, or genocidewatch.org. Any of those, and you can find this study. I realized after we published it, we should have put it in a specialized genocide journal, and maybe it would have gotten more attention than in a public health journal. But the truth is that when the term genocide is used to describe crimes against humanity, use of force becomes possible. When the crimes are only called ethnic cleansing or crimes against humanity, it's a sure indicator of lack of political will to take forceful action to stop them. Since 2000, the term atrocities, in my view, has replaced ethnic cleansing and crimes against humanity as an indicator of absence of will to take forceful action to stop those crimes. As I said, the most relevant case was Kosovo, where declaration of genocide by the U.S. War Crimes Ambassador brought about almost immediate NATO action. One way, I believe, to undermine the ideological attraction of ISIS is indictment of ISIS leaders by the International Criminal Court, by national courts in Iraq, and by national courts in the Netherlands, Germany, and other nations that have effective universal jurisdiction for genocide and crimes against humanity. I also, of course, believe that ISIS must be defeated militarily and ideologically. I believe ISIS, in fact, is the gravest threat to Western civilization that we have had since Nazism and communism. Because Syria and Iraq are not state parties to the ICC, only the UN Security Council can refer ISIS to the ICC. And Russia and China have indicated they would block such referral. I've talked to the representatives for both of those countries in New York. However, the UN General Assembly could create a mixed international tribunal in cooperation with the government of Iraq, as it did with the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia, which I was very directly involved in creating. So a mixed tribunal is one way to deal with the perpetrators, but I also encourage the government of the Netherlands to prosecute the people who do return from ISIS in the Middle East, to prosecute them if there's sufficient evidence for violation of crimes against humanity, and also probably under the terrorism laws of the Netherlands. So that is my statement, and I'm delighted if we can take questions and discuss this.
Thank you very much, Professor Stanton, for a very clear statement. I'm looking at the members to see who has some questions.
Yep.
Mr. Voordewijn.
Thank you, Dr. Stanton, for your view on the difference between ethnic cleansing and genocide. It's revealing that it apparently is used so consciously to not take action by member states. You said that the Security Council, within the Security Council, Russia and China will probably block a resolution against ISIS. Why are you so sure that they will block, even if it's a limited resolution only focused to ISIS? Because Russia at this moment is also fighting ISIS, and it seems that there is a general agreement that ISIS is the general enemy of all parties at this moment. So why are you so assured that they will block it?
I agree that Russia and China shouldn't, because both of them are fighting Islamic terrorists in their own countries. But I have talked to the representatives of Russia and China in New York, and basically Russian representatives told me we will never again refer a case from the UN Security Council to the International Criminal Court, because the International Criminal Court is now investigating us for what we did in Georgia. I do not take that as a final answer. I think that through use of diplomacy, possibly the Russian Orthodox Church, and by the way, I'm meeting with one of the high patriarchs of the Russian Orthodox Church here at the State Department tomorrow. We may be able to change their minds on that. And I also think that China just might not block it. But I think that probably a better approach in this case might be to just go through the General Assembly and create a mixed tribunal that includes Iraqi and international judges. The only problem that I have with that approach is, as I learned from Cambodia, it is a slow process to do that. The ICC is already up and running. It could take the case immediately. I like that better. So, we will see.
Yes. Dr. Stanton, thank you very much for having this opportunity to speak to you. You said in your introduction that calling genocide by its proper name, you investigated that actually increases the chances of military activity or any activity with four times.
Yes.
And whereas that might be a call to arm to some nations or many nations, I would state that's certainly not the case for the Netherlands, and this is where my problem comes, because whether it is Kosovo or Libya or the Yazidis in the northern Iraq, we were always there, many times actually even in the beginning, in the forefront. And if we would be pressed or forced to legally use that term, and I'm not so much saying or pretending that as a parliament, because the parliament actually can still use it, because we don't have F-16s at our disposal, but if our government would be pressed or forced to use that term, that would sort of that could actually make us more conservative in applying military force when it is most needed. Do you understand that reasoning? Have you given any consideration to the opposite effect of what you are actually advocating with countries like ours?
I do indeed, and not only countries like yours. It's also true of our military here in the U.S. My son was a U.S. Marine in Iraq in the height of the insurgency. Believe me, the people in the U.S. are not happy when their sons get sent, to another country to fight. As my son, in fact, told me, I asked him when he came back, I said, well, son, what is your conclusion? And he said, Dad, war is the worst of all possible alternatives. And, I think that, in other words, it's only a last resort and to use force. So I understand that very well. And in fact, I would say the greatest reluctance for intervention in our government comes from the Defense Department.
Same here.
I remember that very well when I was in the State Department. If we wanted to have a peacekeeping force or some other use of force, it was always the Defense Department most reluctant to do that. And they said, look, if you're going to do it, you have to do it all the way, and be sure you have the financial capability and the will to follow through on it. And that is, I think, a very good actual instinct, and a good it's not just an instinct, it's good reasoning to make it last resort. So I do understand that. Let me just, however, address one thing. I did not mean that the Genocide Convention requires legally that you use the word genocide, and it doesn't require legally that you engage in military response. That is left unsaid or unclear in the Genocide Convention. I meant by saying that it increased the likelihood of forceful action by 4 times, that it increases it politically. In other words, that genocide as a word still has a moral force that increases the likelihood of political decisions that will result in forceful action. I understand, however, not all countries are going to want to sign up, to join military action.
Maybe I can just elaborate a little bit on that, because you're talking here to a country that takes the more stringent, more conservative, narrow explanation of Article 1 of the Treaty of 48.
Right.
And therefore, we would like to have a little bit of more political leeway, for the simple fact that if we would be pressed, like in your example with Colin Powell in Darfur, when he said, yes, literally speaking, this could be called a genocide, but it doesn't mean that we need to take action. You can already see what type of limbo you get your executive in.
Right.
So know what you wish for when you ask us to go to more automation of using the term genocide, because it could actually mean that we get more conservative on applying military force.
I understand. Let me, though, simply answer that by saying I do agree with you that Article 1 of the Genocide Convention does not force you to use military force, or for that matter, any other thing. It simply says that, the states parties undertake to prevent and punish the crime of genocide. It is not more than that, but I also believe that when the word genocide should be applied, that is when we meet the definition, and I think that's very clear with ISIS. We should use the word. Call a spade a spade.
I understand.
Mr. Van Helft.
Yeah, thank you. We just spoke with our commission to Mr. Unger of the University of Utrecht, and he said that we give too much attention to ISIS when you see how many victims ISIS makes among Christians comparable to other groups who commit genocide-like actions in Syria and Iraq. Last month, the report of Open Doors and Served and Middle East Concerns said that 50 to 80% of the Christians in the Middle East is dead or fled. How do you think about the eventually overestimating the role of ISIS in those numbers?
I agree with him. I would say the Assad regime has killed far, far more people, than ISIS. And for that matter, the whole a number of parties in Syria have killed many more people than ISIS. For the most part, I believe most of those are crimes against humanity and war crimes, indiscriminate bombing of civilians and so forth. But I think there is a genocidal aspect also to Assad's campaign against Sunni Muslims. He's an Alawite, and they know that if they lose power, it will be all over for them. And so I do think there's a genocidal aspect to the Syrian regime's bombing and mass killing. For that matter, also, I think there's been mass killing committed by other groups. So I think he's right. But it doesn't mean that ISIS as an entity isn't really different than a lot of the others, because ISIS has a very conscious genocidal ideology, whereas I don't think you'll find that same very obvious expression of it, in the Syrian regime or in the Iraqi regime.
And if I may, thank you. And how should we deal? I'm not sure if you said in one of the last sentences you said something about it, but how should we deal with people from the Netherlands who left to Syria to serve the ISIS army and then come back? Because we have 50, according to Dutch, what is the AVD? AVD, the intelligence in the Netherlands, CIA, the Dutch CIA.
I see.
Yeah, 50 people came back from Syria to the Netherlands. How should we deal with them?
I think try them in Dutch courts. If you have adequate evidence that these people have participated in a criminal organization of the type of ISIS, you may have laws that, in fact, outlaw that in the Netherlands. I do not have enough knowledge of Dutch law to know if are there such laws. We do have such laws in the United States against criminal organizations. And as you may remember, in Nuremberg, simply being a member of the SS itself was a criminal offense. But if you can tie them to actual participation, of course, directly in killings, they should be tried. And for the young people, I have actually talked to young people in Iraq who escaped from ISIS or were liberated from ISIS, and who had to go through these terrible trainings that ISIS, they made them watch decapitations, they made them shoot people and things of that kind. I've talked to young people who were forced to do that, and I agree with Dutch law that those young people should be treated very differently than the people who voluntarily went to Syria and joined ISIS.
Can I ask you one last question on that point? Indeed, our first part of the hearing today was on exactly what happens to young children who follow that training. And we were aware that there are Dutch citizens among them. What does that training exactly entail? You just said people are being beheaded. They have to watch executions. What kind of training do they get? What kind of dangers does that pose to our Western societies?
I think it's a significant danger. I think they really do need a very conscious, if you will, re-education. Now, I don't mean forced re-education, but I do think a sensitive de-traumatization and re-education of these young people. Perhaps that shows my Protestant heritage. I believe in the possibility of reform and not sort of immediate condemnation. So, I do think I think they will need significant dealing with, and I would not simply loose them upon the public without such re-education.
And are there any programs that serve as an example anywhere in the world at the moment for these youngsters?
Yes, indeed. I think the best example is Rwanda, where they have taken, first of all, a very, I think, enlightened use of African traditional justice to have what they call gacaca or on-the-grass courts. They held over 100,000 local trials in which the crimes during the genocide were very much exposed, where the people who committed them admitted to what they did, and then largely community service sorts of sentences were given to the people who confessed. And among them, of course, were young people. And those young people were part of that process. And so they saw the need for confession and for their own owning up and accountability for their crimes. And it has worked. It has worked. I mean, I don't say Rwanda is perfect, but in schools in Rwanda, Tutsis and Hutus no longer are segregated in the classrooms. They work together. They eat together. This is a country that has truly made, I think, a resurrection.
Okay, can I ask you one final question on this? What exactly would be the legal obligation the Netherlands are under if we were to use the word genocide for the ongoing atrocities, ethnic cleansing and acts of genocide in Syria and Iraq? Does it mean that we become liable for our own citizens' acts? Do we have to stop them at the border? And what kind of things should we do immediately? And by the way, we could also be morally bound. I mean, I'm not only talking, but I'm talking about legal obligations.
Yes.
Again.
I've always regretted this, but unfortunately, of course, under the Genocide Convention, it would not. The Genocide Convention itself would not legally require the Netherlands to take any specific actions if the word genocide is used. I wish it were not so, but it is so. It is not a magic word. You know, it is not some kind of word that's only administered by a priesthood of judges. It is a word that should be used when it applies, but it does not have a legal compulsion built into it. I think it has a moral aspect, however, a very strong one. And I think that means that the Netherlands should do what it is capable of doing. And that does not mean sending in its troops. It does mean doing what it can, and especially with its own citizens, to either re-educate them, to try them if they committed the crimes. That is, by the way, required in the Genocide Convention. There are only two things required in the Genocide Convention. One is to try those for whom there is evidence that they committed genocide and either were in your country or were your citizens. And so that actually would be an obligation, legal obligation. And secondly, you have to extradite people who are within your territory, who are wanted in another country and against whom there is sufficient evidence for extradition.
Thank you very much, President Stanton, on behalf of our committee for being available for this evidence. We've had a long hearing and we'll get back to you on what we will do to it. The clerk will get back to you what the follow-up actions were. One of the things which was discussed today is how the Netherlands is going to use its seat at the UN Security Council next year. So we may once again support you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.